Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to those of you who are joining us by Zoom. My name's Andrew O'Shaughnessy. I'm the Robert H. Smith Director at the International Center for Jefferson Studies here at Monticello. The International Center is a campus of 73 acres, and we host up to about 30 visiting scholars each year who present their forum at some point during what is usually a visit of 1 month. It's a pleasure today to introduce one of those fellows who is returning for a second fellowship, and is also a former student of mine from Wisconsin, Melissa Adler, who will be talking on the subject of haunted ontologies, thinking with ghosts at Monticello. Melissa is an associate professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at the University of Western Ontario. Her book, Cruising the Library, Perversities in the Organization of Knowledge, was published by Fordham University Press in 2017. It is a study of the history of sexuality through the lens of the Library of Congress's classifications and categories. Her current book project is entitled Informing Empire, Knowledge, Organization in Thomas Jefferson's Information Age, which examines the convergence of racialization, capital, state power, and information in the 18th and 19th centuries. Please join me in welcoming Melissa Adler. Thank you. And I should add, because I often forget, that the audience are welcome to submit questions during the presentation on the Q&A, and we'll try and answer as many of those as possible. Thank you very much indeed. Melissa.
Hi, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Andrew, for the introduction and for welcoming me here again. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me. Here we go. And I'm going to play from the start. So, okay. As Andrew said, this is my second fellowship here at the Center for Jefferson Studies. When I first came in 2018, I had really just kind of begun my project on Jefferson's book catalogs. And I was trying to find evidence of emergent categories for race in his analytic order. And so my previous research, as Andrew mentioned, had been on the Library of Congress classification, which organizes books in research libraries today. This is what we are, as researchers, pretty accustomed to in our libraries. And so my thought after that project was to go back farther and see if we could discern whether the universalization of whiteness that's observed in present-day systems was encoded also in early American information infrastructures. So Jefferson sold his personal collection of around 6,000 books and has classified an index catalog to the Library of Congress after the existing library had been burned in the War of 1812. That's pretty common knowledge among those of us who think about Jefferson. Closely reading the order of books in that catalog revealed what I had suspected. My most significant finding during that fellowship in 2018 was the way that Jefferson simultaneously described Ignatius Sancho's writing in his notes on the state of Virginia and classified Sancho's work in his catalog. So Sancho was an incredibly important figure in his day. His book, Letters of the Late Ignatius Sancho, was one of the earliest accounts of African slavery written in English by a former enslaved person. And so what was interesting is that Jefferson wrote this in his notes on the state of Virginia. He said, Ignatius Sancho has approached nearer to the merit in composition, yet his letters do more honor to the heart than the head. Upon the whole, though we admit him to the first place among those of his own color, who have presented themselves to the public judgment, yet when we compare him with the writers of the race among whom he lived, and particularly with the epistolary class in which he has taken his own stand, we are compelled to enroll him at the bottom of the column. And so that's exactly what he did in his catalog. And so this is his library catalog. This is an early version. It's not the one that was finally sold to the Library of Congress, but you do see he's at the bottom of the column here. And so I found that this was really compelling, that he's doing these two things simultaneously. The fact that he's writing this in prose in the Notes on the State of Virginia, and then sort of informationalizing this in a library catalog seems significant to me. And we could also say something about it being in the epistolary chapter. One could argue that it belongs in history, but that's sort of another conversation. Anyway, I've since figured out that this was a pattern, and Jefferson placed books about Black people and Africa at the bottom of the column in every section in which they appeared. For example, in the latest version of the catalog, which he sold to the Library of Congress, there's a chapter 16, which is devoted to ethics and is divided into moral philosophy and law of nature and nations. That last third of moral philosophy is a list of books about ethical relations with the other in Jefferson's world. Of the 139 titles listed in moral philosophy, the 13 books about slavery and Black culture are listed last of all the books in the chapter. And then in the world history chapter, there are about 10 books in that section. They're all also at the end. Most of those books are about the Barbary States, which would have been particularly interesting or of import to Jefferson. So that's where I am now. That's where I started, and that's sort of one of the places where I've gone with this project. This is a photo I took last weekend at the Library of Congress of Jefferson's library. And they have all his many of his books there. So one of the questions that I had 4 years ago was not only whether it's possible to discern this sort of universalization of whiteness or this placing of books about racialized others at the bottom of a column, was whether it was possible to draw a connection or something like a lineage between Jefferson's knowledge organization techniques and what scholars are finding in today's algorithmic cultures and in today's libraries and so on. There's overwhelming evidence that so many of the algorithms that organize our lives are based on racist assumptions. Jessica Marie Johnson sees a connection between the past and present when she writes, quote, African slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, and the plantation complex remained the underlying operating system of American freedom. Computers and digital technology exist beneath the sun as well. So in my work, I've tried to really stay with Jefferson, taking care not to draw lines between the past and present, but sometimes signaling connections. It is primarily a history book, but I'm in a field that's interested in practice. Information studies, information science, whatever you want to call it, is really interested in practice and how this matters in the present. And I think especially when we are thinking about decolonizing libraries and information technologies, it's really, I think, important to think about how these things matter in our present. And so a lot of this talk is actually sort of methodological, and I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are. I'll be curious to see what you think. So Anne-Laura Stoller suggests that projects that trace legacies and vestiges of the past in the various present contexts are often complicit in drawing a line between the past and present, writing and thinking as if there has been a clear line or a clear break. In some ways, this serves to distance our current predicaments from other moments and eras, affirming a colonial past distinct from a colonial, post-colonial present. But rather than seeing vestiges of the past in the present or locating ruptures or continuities, she asks us to attune to the, quote, colonial entailments that cling to present conditions. Methodologically, trying to make sense of recurrences is a difficult task, not least because they will not appear as they did before. Recursions are going to be found in processes of partial reinscriptions, modified displacements, and amplified recuperations. So rather than citing the well-worn notion that history repeats itself, it's preferable to think of the ways in which the material and conceptual conditions of the past are reconfigured and reanimated. They reappear in new forms and new technologies and reassert relations of power. And so I'm trying to follow Stoller and Foucault's lead in intending to the archive itself, the formation of the archive. And so thinking about Jefferson in the formation of the archive or of information technologies, information practices. I'm really interested in the ways that Jefferson and of course his colleagues, he was not in isolation, but he was uniquely, he did have a unique vision and he was uniquely aware of the power of information. And so I'm interested in how these have been instrumental in the formation of the early republic and also sort of what those colonial entailments are that cling to the present. And so the task I've sort of set for myself is to draw connections across Jefferson's archival, documentary, and knowledge organization methods to understand this moment in interlocking histories of information, racialization, nation-making, empire expansion. And rather than trying to identify a revolutionary information age or origin story, I want to discern the ways in which Jefferson's technologies mattered in his information age and how certain structuring techniques have been instrumental in the durability of settler colonial conditions in the present. So this is why I refer to haunted ontologies in my title. So when ontology, or the study of being and the organization of beings, becomes operationalized or formalized in systems, it becomes an ontology, a system for organizing information. Ontologies are now integral to digital information and communication technologies, but I would suggest that we can see their emergence in early political arithmetic and other documentary contexts, such as Jefferson's library. As John Cheney Lippold notes, quote, ontologies are embedded within a set of power relations, and the categories that are bred from those ontologies exercise a profound impact on how we as subjects encounter our world. And so I've been thinking about this in terms of haunting, drawing directly from Jacques Derrida's concept of hauntology, because I think it's useful to think about the ways our information systems are mediums that are haunted by both those who made the systems, like a Jefferson, but perhaps more importantly, the people whose lives were reduced to data points and categories, or who are absent from the documentary record entirely. As Avery Gordon writes, quote, following the ghost is about making contact that changes you and refashions the social relations in which you are located. It is sometimes about writing ghost stories, stories that not only repair representational mistakes, but also strive to understand the conditions under which a memory was produced in the first place, toward a counter memory for the future. So this is a photo of the stone house at Tufton, which is where I'm staying. And so credit goes to Derek Wheeler for sharing this photo with me. And he knew it would be of interest because there's some ghostly figures in that bottom corner on the right. There's a girl and her dog, and it's really fascinating. So yeah, I'm staying near this. I'm staying on Tufton, which was part of Jefferson's plantation. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to attend to while I'm here, is the land. Because this has grown into a book-length project with chapters on Jefferson and his influence on not just libraries and not just archives, but also museums, newspapers, encyclopedias, encryption, algorithms, surveillance, geographic information, and more. It's turned out to be gigantic. And I am looking in particular for the ways in which racialization was encoded in these various practices and techniques and technologies. And so I'm not going to go into detail about those pieces or those specific technologies. Feel free to ask about those in the Q&A. But most of that research is indeed complete. And what I've come here to do is to get a stronger understanding of the landscape as as I wrap it up and sort of try to figure out what this is all doing. I'm interested in thinking really deeply about the people who inhabited this land by staying at Tufton, one of Jefferson's quarter farms. As I did the first time I was here, I'm really attending to this place. I'm trying to listen, to see, to pay attention, to follow the ghosts. I keep my windows open at night so that I can hear all the animals, all the very strange sounds. The coyotes howl and hunt and chatter almost every night, and it's all very strange and unsettling. But it's about trying to attune to the landscape, the place. Partly because I think that there's a relationship between land and landscape and classification. And I think especially in Jefferson's world, we see evidence of the relationship between the visual field, quite literally, his fields, and the organization of knowledge, grids, ledgers, and so on, that they have to be thought together. Also the architecture of his house and so on, all the different ways in which he managed the visual field. So Jefferson's vision, his worldview, how that was programmed into information technologies, that's the project. So here I have to thank Fraser Nyman and Derek Wheeler, who have spent time with me at Monticello and Tufton to help me think about what Jefferson saw and what others saw on these grounds here. I'm trying to understand the weight of it all by being in place so that I can sort of grasp this relationship between settler colonialism, land, and the history of information technologies. Okay, so more Derrida. He's all over this. All over this paper. He reminds us that the Greek root of the word archive has two simultaneous meanings. It refers to places of origin, there where things commence, physical, historical, or ontological principle, and it refers to law, which matters because Jefferson was trained in law. There where men and gods command, there where authority, social order are exercised in this place from which order is given. He also explains that the meaning of archive, its only meaning, comes to it from the Greek archeon, initially a house, a domicile, an address, the residence of the superior magistrates, the archons, those who commanded. And then the Oxford English Dictionary confirms that arch means chief, principal, first in authority, or order, combining all these ideas of firstness, authority, and order in its definition. And so it's no accident that archive, architect, archaeology all share the same root. The OED also indicates that architect refers to a master builder, or quote, one who designs and frames any complex structure, especially the creator. And archaeology is the study of beginnings. And so the ancient view of archives applies all too well to Jefferson, the architect, master of the house on the little mountain, public authority, commander-in-chief. He designed Monticello and its surrounding landscape, as well as the University of Virginia and other buildings based on European revivals of Greek architecture. Some people call Jefferson the father of American archaeology because he studied indigenous languages and dug up Monacan burial grounds near here to discover the origins of the human race. These aspects of Jefferson must be considered alongside his archive and the information architectures that confirmed and carried his authority. Jefferson is important in the history of memory practices, specifically the ways in which the acts of committing to record are embedded into technical, social, and formal practices, which carry descriptions from the past into the future to be remembered. So my method is also akin to E.L. Weitzman's forensic architecture, because I'm thinking about Jefferson's information architecture, again, alongside his other architectures, landscape, the home, and so on. For Weitzman and his team, the concept of forensic architecture, quote, refers to the production of architectural evidence and to its presentation in juridical and political forms. This frame is relevant not only for what we typically think of as our built environment, buildings, roads, landscapes, cities, etc., but also for information architectures. Like Weitzman, I've located the construction of information infrastructures in their historical context to make explicit the co-production of socio-political, cultural processes and the organization and production of information techniques and technologies. Regarding Jefferson's archive and architectures forensically and archaeologically is an intentional methodological stance, reverses the gaze onto the master architect to consider the ways in which information architectures also affect access to human rights. I'm drawing from the extensive archaeological evidence that's already been collected and analyzed at Monticello, thanks to Fraser and Derek and others, the vast research of Jefferson scholars, as well as key documents that reveal Jefferson's web of interconnected strategies and techniques. His information architectures arguably mirror the architecture of his home with its underground and hidden labor forces and the ways in which he constructed his landscape. On his plantation alone, he devised several techniques to optimize vision, heighten production, keep the operation in smooth running order. Following Ruha Benjamin, attending to the, quote, sticky web of carcerality shows that Jefferson's plantation demonstrates the institutional and imaginative underpinnings of oppressive systems. They extend from the prison itself to the plantation, as Lucia Stanton has shown in her research, where he carved out a landscape, perfected his house for the surveillance of others, developed technologies for efficiency, documented all aspects of production, including the people he enslaved. As Linda Toohey Y. Smith writes, views about the other have existed for centuries, but during the Enlightenment, these views became more formalized through science, philosophy, and imperialism into explicit systems of classification and regimes of truth. So this shift has much to do with secularization of knowledge and the development of the scientific method. And of course, Jefferson was a man of his time, an intellectual in the era of Enlightenment, and he had an insatiable appetite for knowledge. Facts were central to Jefferson's science, politics, and plantation management. Classification became increasingly central to scientific progress as a method for ordering phenomena to contain and control them. As a master of his plantation, he organized the landscape so that he could manage visibility and invisibility for his purposes. And so again, I'm really interested in how that visibility works to produce categories. Because I think that one of the things that's interesting about Jefferson is that he doesn't have firm categories. In his catalog, for instance, he doesn't name a category for Blackness, for example, but you can see in his analytic order that they're grouped together, the books about Black people or Black culture or Africa. So he's not naming them, but they're emerging. And I think that that's important. And then other places you can see that there's just different ways in the ledgers or in his drawings that there are definite lines being drawn, even if categories are not explicitly named. And so insofar as information infrastructures undergird memory institutions like libraries, archives, and museums, as well as government and corporate records, I think these structures should be regarded as architecture of memory. And by inscribing these in administrative, state, and domestic documents, they attained a truth value, particularly because they carry the authority and signature of Jefferson. As Vern Harris explains, the archive has a way of subverting the conscious desires of those who create it and curate it. What was erased or destroyed may return. And so this is where this notion of haunting, I think, is important. My aim is to think about the ways that the configuration of knowledge was instrumental to expansion, and to think with ghosts that inhabit the systems of the present. As Simon Gikandi writes, slavery functioned as the great unconscious in the infrastructure of modern identity. And the afterlife of the plantation is materialized in today's information infrastructures. As Nathan Snaza explains, the very social order that has become so naturalized and is so easily taken for granted, quote, dulls us to particular aspects of our world. And so diving in to the very order and its principles, I think, might bring some understanding about how it functioned and how it's been sustained over generations. Dwelling in the very space, as I am in Tufton, in which a colonial imaginary is given shape and substance, can unsettle knowledge by drawing attention toward questions of how that political social order was able to emerge and at what costs. Okay, and I want to also suggest here that, so moving in now to another layer of haunting, I think, because I think it's really important to think about the ways that these techniques are inscribed by loss. The years in which Jefferson was engaged in the writing projects described above, the notes on the state of Virginia in his library catalog, were tumultuous ones for Jefferson. And I should note that both of those were iterative, right? So the notes on the state of Virginia were begun and then revised, and the same with his catalog. But it seems that there was a moment where he really worked intensely on these. So in this moment, he was serving as governor of Virginia when he received the request for the information about Virginia in 1780. So this is where the notes on the state of Virginia begin. Shortly after, he escapes to Poplar Forest because he was nearly captured by British troops at his home in Monticello. He fell from his horse and was confined there for a few weeks. And a year later, May 8th, 1782, his daughter Lucy was born, and his wife Martha's health took a turn. Another daughter, Lucy, had died in infancy a year earlier. And Martha dies then due to complications after childbirth in September of that year. Jefferson completed the first iteration of his book catalog in March of 1783. That's when he sort of writes a date there in his catalog, approximately 6 months after his wife Martha died. And although he did send his responses to Marbois about the notes, like an early version of the notes on the state of Virginia in 1781, according to Douglas Wilson, he substantially corrected and enlarged the text during the 2.5 years between the time he sent Marbois the answers in December 1781 and his departure for Paris in July 1784. Fawn Brodie suggests that cataloging his books was indeed an act of mourning, or a, quote, remedy for loneliness and despair. And Kevin J. Hayes expands on this assessment, writing, quote, upon his wife's death, Jefferson's library became a site of mourning. It became a place of solitude where he could find order by devising his own personal idiosyncratic scheme of knowledge. Developed in the aftermath of his wife's death, his organizational scheme also offered a way to erect barriers to guard against the vagaries of life and death. Or, as Susan Manning puts it, here perhaps are the comforts of classification in the dark night of the soul. His project seems to have intensified while Martha was still alive, and then even more after she passed. Jefferson's daughter reported years later that during the months in which Martha's health declined, he was absorbed in 2 tasks. When not at her bedside, he was writing in a small room which opened immediately at the head of her bed. It's worth considering whether the devotedness with which he attended to the notes on the state of Virginia and the classification of his books might be best understood as an act of control for memory keeping by preserving knowledge and putting everything in its place to ensure some sense of security. 6 years later, Jefferson has gone to France and is about to return to Virginia. For context, Sally Hemings was probably pregnant at the time. She's expressed a wish to stay in France. Jefferson makes a promise to her that all of her children not yet born will be freed when they turn 21 if she comes back with him. So on September 6, 1789, Jefferson delivered one of his most famous declarations in a letter to his friend and colleague, James Madison. He insisted upon his belief that rights to land must belong to the living, that the dead have neither powers nor rights over it. Indeed, one might read between the lines and speculate that his own present was haunted by the ghosts of landowners past, and he was concerned that their legacy would do harm for future generations. I set out on this ground, which I suppose to be self-evident, that the earth belongs in usufruct to the living, that the dead have neither powers nor rights over it. The portion occupied by any individual ceases to be his when himself ceases to be and reverts to the society. No man can, by natural right, oblige the lands he occupied or the persons who succeed him in that occupation to the payment of debts contracted by him. For if he could, he might, during his own life, eat up the usufruct of the lands for several generations to come, and then the lands would belong to the dead and not the living, which would be the reverse of our principle. So by invoking the legal term in usufruct, regarding the stewardship of property belonging to another, Jefferson maintained that the role of the founding fathers was to establish a republic in which the coming generations of educated citizens would be in control of their own destiny. As John Ragosta, Peter Odoff, and Andrew O'Shaughnessy write in their introduction to their volume, Jefferson the Revolutionary was dedicated to liberating the living generation from the dead hand of the past and the old structures of knowledge and power controlled by kings, nobles, and priests. End quote. But what this passage conceals, what his letter conceals, is the tragedy of the fact that the land that he called his own was formerly Monacan Indian Nation land, and the construction of his house, the fruits of his tobacco and wheat fields, the nails made in his factory were the products of the labor of stolen people. For Jefferson to use the language of bondage to refute the notion that one generation of man has no right to bind another is particularly scalding, considering the fact that he was just about to embark on his return to Monticello, where the enslaved population has been working in his absence, and where Sally Hemings will lose rights to freedom that she may have enjoyed in France, and where at the end of his own life, the people that he enslaved would be sold and separated to pay for the debts that he incurred. So Jefferson's knowledge organization techniques, I find, are best articulated in some ways through Derrida's concept of ontology, which gives a frame and a language for describing the processes at play when mourning becomes an impetus for organizing, acquiring, and controlling knowledge. So this is Derrida. First of all, mourning. It consists always in attempting to ontologize remains, to make them present in the first place by identifying the bodily remains and by localizing the dead. One has to know. One has to know it. One has to have knowledge. Now, to know is to know who and where, to know whose body it really is and what place it occupies, for it must stay in its place. Jefferson was a master at keeping everything in its place, and to me it makes a lot of sense to think of his disciplinary exercises as a suite of attempts of warding off ghosts. In particular, the relationship that Derrida identifies between knowledge and place is extraordinary for its explanatory power. Jefferson classified the objects across his own universe, placing them in categories that identified their function, their location, their relevance to his life and purpose. I'm thinking not only of his catalogs and his professional papers, but his farm books and other ledgers in which the classified things were in fact the humans he enslaved. What if it's the case that the relationship between mastery and control is rooted in mourning, the grief that comes with loss, the anxiety around the possibility of loss, the need to keep order so that things won't become lost, gathering and collecting and ordering are techniques in trying to understand what happened. And so while Jefferson may have felt oppressed by the ghosts of landowners before him and was keenly aware of the bonds of kinship across generations, we have to honor the ghosts of the most oppressed while recognizing that we are living with the ghosts of the oppressor. Derrida asks us to turn toward the ghosts of the people who were taken and bought and sold and killed for the sake of profit and empire. No justice seems possible or thinkable without the principle of some responsibility beyond all living present within that which disjoins the living present. before the ghosts of those who are not yet born, who are already dead, be they victims of wars, political or other kinds of violence, nationalist, racist, colonialist, sexist, or other kinds of exterminations, victims of the oppressions of capitalist imperialism or any of the forms of totalitarianism. Okay, so unlike Jefferson, who wishes the previous generations would let loose of their hold on him, we must learn, as according to Derrida, to live with ghosts in the upkeep, the conversation, the company, or the companionship, in the commerce without commerce of ghosts, to live otherwise and better, no, not better, but more justly, but with them. And this being with specters would also be not only, but also a politics of memory, of inheritance, and of generations. Indeed, Jefferson's catalog and his later record-keeping techniques can be understood in this context of memory, archiving, and loss. More than a decade before Martha's death, his childhood home at Shadwell had burned to the ground. What Jefferson found most upsetting about the fire was the loss of his books and personal and professional papers. I believe that Jefferson's acts of mourning structured and were structured by experience in ways that we can't fully understand, but surely can contemplate. As Avery Gordon writes, quote, being haunted draws us effectively, sometimes against our will, and always a bit magically, into the structured feeling of a reality we come to experience not as cold knowledge, but as a transformative recognition. I suggest we continue to be haunted in ways that structure our knowledge and experience. The history of libraries and archives is the history of the preservation of the cultural record. The fear of loss of information is one of the great drivers of the profession. And traditions of librarianship and archival practice are rooted in old principles about preservation and history making. The effects of classifications are always deferred, just as the archive is always incomplete. Their meaning and influence are ongoing and unfolding. I would say that a classification is differently incomplete from an archive. It frames the contents of the archive, outlines the contents in terms of presences and unnamed absences, and it also indexes exclusion. We archive something that we don't want to lose, that we want to remember. We might repress that which we don't. The archive is a medium by which transferences of ghostly traces across generations occur. But the colonial archive contains very particular kinds of memories, and the archival absences must also be recognized as loss that must be grieved. Avery Gordon describes the challenge of the work that needs to be done to retrieve the memory that has been repressed, whether that censorship has been a suppression of the cultural record or the psychic apparatus, or both. How does one search for something they don't consciously register as an absence? How do we find the stories of the missing if we lack awareness that they ever existed in the first place? Indeed, she says, we need to know that something is missing in order to even begin to look for it, or its dispersion of gestures anywhere in the archive or in the imaginary zone. And so it's a matter of opening oneself to the necessity of living with the ghosts, of listening to what they have to say. It's a matter of paying attention to absences and silences in the archive, the undocumented and the classified. In the case of Sally Hemings, for example, the fact that she appears in Jefferson's archive only in his farm book and memorandum books means that we have to follow different kinds of traces. Like I would say Annette Gordon-Reed does so beautifully in her very detailed account. And like the Getting Word project that features the stories and histories of African-American families at Jefferson's plantation, we have to reconsider what counts as data and knowledge. And I think it's important to look for the stories that were repressed in the archives, as well as the colonial entailments that cling. To my mind, it's also about using the ghostly haunt as a guide as we do the decolonial and reparative work across the disciplines and in information systems. And so I'm going to leave that there. And to say, yeah, there's so much really great work being done in terms of that kind of decolonial and reparative type of work. And I think that the reason I focus so much on Jefferson, because people ask me this all the time, is that I do think that he gives us a window into how the colonial archive operates. And I think that part of the whole process of decolonization is also that dismantling and understanding how it works in the first place. So that's kind of how I see this project. So I'm very curious to know what your responses are. I'm going to stop sharing and come back. There.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Melissa. I've always been fascinated by the work you're doing about the assumptions and biases behind what often seem pseudo-scientific categories and neutral classification systems, which of course you show they're not. I was curious, you said that Jefferson undoubtedly is grouping the books on African Americans together and race, but doesn't explicitly say so. On the other hand, he does have a classification system. So what category are they located, those books?
Yeah, so I would say that, yeah, because he has, depending on the iteration of the catalog.
The Baconian system.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
There's the three very broad categories of history or memory, philosophy / reason, and the fine arts or imagination. Yeah, based on Bacon and Diderot and D'Alembert. And then within that, there's, a range of chapters. And that number moves, but it's, roughly 40 or 44, however you look at it. And those chapters are labeled, those are named for sure. So there's world history, there's geography, there's that. But then within those, a few of those are subdivided a bit into maybe 2 parts or 3 parts or something like that. But yeah, so the one example that I used of the books in the ethics chapter, for example, I thought that was interesting because the moral philosophy section, it begins with, the Greeks and Romans and goes all the way up to his contemporaries that are doing the work of moral philosophy. And then there's a section that's more about sort of ethical relations with the other. That's how I'm seeing that. Like there's religious tolerance and so on. There's books about women and family. And then there's this chunk of books that are about slavery mostly, but there's also books about like Black literature and stuff like that. So, and they're all together at the very end of that section. So, yeah. And so he doesn't name those categories, like he doesn't have a category for women or for Africans or whatever he would have called that at that time. Black people, whatever he would have said. They're not named, but you can see them within these broader sections. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes. Since you were last here, Andrina Tay and Diana Aaron Price have written an article, you've probably seen it, on Jefferson's filing systems and even his furniture designed so he could retrieve information within a minute or so. And it seems to me one justification for focusing on Jefferson is that he took such an obsessive interest in classification and had his own idiosyncratic system, and the fact that it partly becomes the basis of the Library of Congress is pretty crucial. Do they adopt his classification system?
They do, but they wreck it. There's this whole thing about how he sends his classified catalog to the Librarian of Congress, and he gave very clear instructions about the order and insisted that needed to be retained. the catalog has been lost. That the catalog that he sent over has been lost. So, but we do know that Watterson, the librarian, did not follow Jefferson's instructions, and instead he kept the chapters, but then rearranged and took out the analytic order within the chapters and arranged them alphabetically. So that system that I'm talking about, where you can see the sort of topically related, like all the books about slavery being together, that goes away, which is interesting, I think, particularly because it kind of comes back.
Have you looked at all at his plans for the university library?
I have, but not as deeply. Yeah.
He listed books and actually unpacked the boxes of books to go into the library, although they never went in during his lifetime. But his list is over 6,000 books, which instantly made it the second largest university library in America after Harvard, which had been founded 2 centuries earlier, and the equivalent of Yale. Although it gives you a perspective that the University of Göttingen in Germany had over 200,000 volumes. So 6,000 was nothing, but in American terms, that was the second largest university library. And he wrote out all the titles by hand, as well as listing suggestions from others. One thing I'd be curious about, and I don't know if this would come into your research, but I realized talking to Andrina Tay that he didn't collect books on anti-slavery, the abolitionist literature, and they weren't in the university library. I mentioned this in my book, and a lot of people pounced on that and thought that was a real sign of his inherent biases. On the other hand, I wondered how many university libraries would have stocked the abolitionist literature, including in the North, because Northern universities weren't especially abolitionist in the early 19th century. In fact, Harvard, Princeton, Yale often kept abolitionists from speaking and showed a lot of support really for the slave system. So I'd be curious if that should ever come up in your research, because I hadn't really thought about it. And of course, even today, how much do we collect sort of political paraphernalia of our own period?
Yeah, I think that is interesting. And I think that the Ignatius Sancho is sort of interesting because he does have that. But he puts it in fine arts as if it's not factual, right? So that's what I think is really like his treatment of this as like not factual information, I think is telling as well. Yeah, that's a really great point. Yeah, for sure. It should come through. I mean, I should look into that. Yeah.
Right. So I've got a question from John here. I'll read it out because I'm not sure I fully understood it when I just sort of glossed over it. It said, I find the idea of Jefferson's cataloging and writing the notes as an act of mourning and control is interesting and powerful. What is comparable from the enslaved community, or do we have to simply accept that as ghosts? And I'm not quite sure what you mean, because obviously there are very few written sources from the enslaved community.
I can't.
He may need to explain that a bit more to us as to what he's getting at. Can you read the question?
No, I can't see the question. Where is that question?
On the Q&A at the bottom.
I see Carol's question.
Right.
But I don't see. That's so interesting.
Right.
Anyway, can you repeat it?
It's the chat section, maybe. So it says, I find the idea of Jefferson's cataloging and writing the notes as an act of mourning and control is interesting and powerful. What is comparable from the enslaved community, or do we have to simply accept that as ghosts?
Yeah, I think that's okay. Okay. I think this gets at the exact thing that I'm trying to figure out, because I wonder if it's doing a disservice to talk about this as haunting, as ghosts. If that in itself is somehow, and that's a real question for me, because we see this a lot. Like there's a lot of literature about ghosts and haunting, and it's a frame that's useful, but I'm not sure if it's, I think, I don't know if it does a disservice. And I think that's my question. But I like, so I'm going to put this together with Carol's question, because Carol's saying, why Derrida? And the reason for Derrida is because he has this term called hauntology, and he's written a book about this notion of hauntology. And to me, that's so perfect, because I'm talking about ontologies as a thing, as operationalized sort of the organization of knowledge. And so I like that as a frame, and I like the way he talks about this stuff. So there's that. But at the same time, I think you're both asking sort of a similar thing. So Carol's saying, why Derrida and not Black feminist writers or things like this, or like, what are you doing there? And I am looking to Black writers and things that didn't come through here at all. So thanks for pointing that out. That's definitely true. But I think it's an open question that I'm wrestling with, and something about it doesn't feel right to me, and I can't figure out what it is. So I think you're both kind of getting at that. And I'm trying to figure that out, because it's about presence. There's something about presence that matters, and I don't know how to articulate that, or it's tricky. It's really hard. So, yeah.
So we've got a question from Andrina Tay. Could you talk more about the parallels you found between Jefferson's classification system and how surveillance was carried out at Monticello and across the landscape?
So what I would say is that this is where Fraser has really been super helpful. So he's taken me on several tours of Monticello. And I mean, I think perhaps the most obvious example is the way in which the property is laid out to maximize or to optimize vision, right? So that there is the literally like underground where the enslaved laborers are working, and the ways in which, like, from his room, because I tried to stand in various rooms and think about what could be seen, what he could see, and what others could see of the house. And I think there definitely is something to be said for the fact that he's trying to make sure that the enslaved people are in very particular lines of sight, right? Or have access to the house in different ways. And so Fraser sort of traces the Monticello one, like the early Monticello and the second Monticello, and shows how the path toward the house changes, access to the house changes, that he's drawing these different paths and sight lines across the property. And just examples of like the dumbwaiter. And people talk about this, you know, like this is pretty common knowledge, I think, the way that the dumbwaiter was a way to make sure that the enslaved servants were not seen, or not seen very much, or things like that. But you could say that, I think, across the plantation, and I'm still trying to figure that out. That's partly why I'm here. But what was really interesting, so I'm going to also then sort of respond partly to Carol's other question about the girl and the dog. So again, like I'm still trying to get capture the weight of it all, but Derek gave this great tour of Tufton yesterday and sort of explained the history of this old stone house that's at Tufton that Thomas Jefferson Randolph probably lived in, and that there was a house there, a wooden structure there as well that probably predated that stone house, and then there's the brick house where the fellows stay, right? So there's all this really interesting things happening in this landscape. But here also, that old wooden house that's not there anymore, apparently one of the hypotheses is that was built for John Craven, who leased that property at Tufton, and 45 people, enslaved people. And so I'm still learning about what that means and how this land is used and parceled and so on. But I can see Monticello from where I'm staying. And so he could have seen me from there too, right? So that there's so many aspects of this, I think, that I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think I'm still trying to figure out. So the girl and the dog in that photo are in front of that stone house that's old. But the photo I think was taken, I can't remember because Derek just sent it to me. And I don't know if we know who the girl and the dog are, but maybe somebody else in the room does. But I have to go look it up.
I'm sure you're familiar with Stanton's comparison to Monticello to Panopticon and the
exactly.
Panopticon.
Yeah, and I'm trying not to repeat that because that research is so compelling and interesting. Yeah.
So we've got a question from my former colleague and friend and your former professor, Jeannie Grant-Moore.
Hi, Jeannie.
Who says, what an intriguing topic, Melissa. I can't imagine how you're organizing and classifying your widespread avenues of inquiry. I loved hearing about the way your mind is working through your research. One issue I find especially fascinating is your look at the visual and the reversal of the gaze. I'm wondering if you've looked at the work of Martin Jay called Downcast Eyes, which is essentially a history of vision. And I don't know if you're familiar with Leslie, that Jeannie's own thesis was actually about the Renaissance, Shakespeare, and ways of looking at things and looking as it appears in Shakespearean plays. One question, you said you were using other figures of study besides Jefferson. Who are they?
So yeah, Jeannie, we should talk. I know, we should talk about the optical and vision. Yeah, for sure. And thanks for the reference. So other figures. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not studying other figures in depth, but I'm trying to look at them in terms of, because I'm trying to make sure that I'm not looking at Jefferson in isolation, right? So all the people that he's working with and in dialogue with. So it's a lot, right? And it just keeps growing and growing and growing. I'm particularly at the moment really obsessed with Charles Wilson Peale and the museum and the ways in which they were exchanging correspondence about so many things about natural history, but also about the polygraph and how and the importance of museums for education and so on. Like, so, I mean, I don't know. I could take a long time to answer that question, but so there's tons and tons of other players that matter, right, in this moment. But yeah, we should talk.
So obviously you're looking at more sinister manifestations, classification, and this is a marvelous period to do so because this is the great period of classification, and that's one of the central features of the Enlightenment. But obviously, there's a much more utilitarian and necessary aspect to all of this. And maybe you don't even need to emphasize it, but I did. One of the colleagues at the university did a book on classification, largely in terms of German literature and universities in this period. His surname's Wellman. I'll check the full book title for you. But one of the points he was making was this sense of people just being deluged with information and overwhelmed by it. It has a very contemporary feel to it, but we're moving from a period when it was possible to be a Renaissance figure and to read the literature in so many fields to a period of specialization where the literature really is too voluminous for any one person to be able to master it across disciplines, and classifications are just very necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I would say that's right. And the work that I really love is Anne Blair's Too Much to Know, because she's talking about this too. And I find her really particularly useful for this project. Because yeah, this notion that there's too much to know, that's been ongoing, and that a lot of these various encyclopedic techniques or reference works, the same conversations were happening during the Renaissance and earlier about if we create these reference works, we're just going to dumb everything down, right? Like, we're going to be stupid. It's like the same thing, like Google's making us stupid. People worry about this. And so, yeah, Anne Blair is pointing to those conversations. There's not always, but there's long been an overabundance of information and anxiety about how to control that. And also worry about, do those various techniques of control and management also lead to a lack of depth and understanding and stupidity? I love it. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to catching up more and talking about your subject. I see we're out of time, but thank you very much indeed for a stimulating presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
It's been a pleasure.